Sometimes life breaks you down so completely that a $75 mansion feels like a second chance. For Wesley Banks, a 46-year-old single father who'd lost his job and his marriage in the same year, that crumbling house was all he had left to give his daughter Paige and their dog Benson. They moved in hoping for peace and a fresh start. But on their third morning, Benson began barking wildly near the overgrown side yard. Wesley followed the dog to a sunroom window and looked inside. Standing there in the daylight was a woman, silent and still, staring back at him. Her name was Delaine, and she'd been living secretly in the mansion's forgotten rooms. Why would someone hide in a house that no one wanted? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Wesley Banks had never imagined his life would come down to $75 and a gamble on a house nobody wanted. 22 years he'd given to Hartfield Manufacturing, working the same assembly line, watching the same faces age alongside his own. He'd started there fresh out of high school, young and strong, believing that steady work and honest effort would build a solid life. And for a while it had. He married Linda when he was 24. They bought a small house on Maple Street with a backyard just big enough for their daughter Paige to run around in. Life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Then the layoffs came last October. The company cited restructuring, overseas competition, the usual reasons that sounded reasonable in a press release, but felt like a gut punch when you were 53 notifications away from retirement. Wesley was number 17 on the list. They gave him 2 weeks' notice and a severance package that barely covered 3 months of bills. Linda left 2 months later. She said it wasn't about the money, that they'd been drifting apart for years, that she needed to find herself again. Wesley didn't argue. He was too tired, too numb. The divorce was finalized in April, and by May she'd remarried, a manager from the grocery store where she worked part-time. Wesley heard about it through Paige, who delivered the news gently, like she was trying not to break something already shattered. Paige had her own wounds. 24 years old with a college degree in communications and a broken engagement that had scattered her carefully laid plans. Her boyfriend of 6 years, Connor, had cheated with someone from their friend group. When Paige found out, she didn't just lose him, she lost the entire social circle they'd built together. Nobody wanted to choose sides, so they chose the easier path and faded away from her. She moved back home last December, sleeping in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by posters she'd never taken down and dreams that felt increasingly distant. Father and daughter circled each other in the small Maple Street house like wounded animals, both trying to be strong for the other, both failing quietly. Wesley took on odd jobs. Lawn work, minor repairs, anything to keep busy and bring in a few dollars. Paige sent out resumes daily, her rejections piling up like unpaid bills. The dog Benson, a 7-year-old golden retriever mix with soulful brown eyes, seemed to be the only one holding them together. He demanded walks and attention, forced them to maintain some routine, some connection to simple pleasures. The county auction happened on a humid Tuesday in late June. Wesley had gone only because he'd seen a flyer at the hardware store advertising foreclosed properties and tax-delinquent land. He wasn't looking to buy anything. He barely had enough saved for next month's rent. But he needed to get out of the house, needed to feel like he was doing something, anything, to change their trajectory. The auction was held in the courthouse parking lot. A bored auctioneer working through a list of properties nobody wanted. Vacant lots with drainage problems. A burned-out gas station on the edge of town. A mobile home missing its wheels. Wesley stood at the back of the small crowd, hands in his pockets, watching people bid without enthusiasm. Then they got to Lot 47, the Pemberton mansion on Old Mill Road. Wesley knew the place by reputation. Everyone in Hartfield did. The massive Victorian sat on 3 acres at the edge of town, hidden behind overgrown trees and a rusted iron fence. It had been abandoned since the 70s, maybe longer. Kids told stories about it being haunted. Adults called it an eyesore. The county had seized it for back taxes years ago and had been trying to unload it ever since. 14 rooms, original 1889 construction, 3 acres of land, the auctioneer droned. Property sold as is, buyer responsible for all repairs and code violations. Do I hear an opening bid of $500? Silence. The crowd shuffled uncomfortably. $500 for a mansion sounded like a bargain until you considered what it would cost to make it livable. $250? The auctioneer tried, sounding tired. More silence. Someone in the front laughed. $100, folks. Surely someone wants this property. Wesley felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the kind of reckless impulse that comes when you've already lost everything that mattered. He raised his hand. 75, he called out. The auctioneer looked at him like he was insane. Sir, the opening bid is... I know, Wesley said. But that's what I've got. $75. The crowd turned to stare. Wesley felt his face flush, but kept his hand up. The auctioneer looked around, waiting for someone else to bid, to save this man from his own foolishness. Nobody did. Sold, the auctioneer said finally, shaking his head. Lot 47 to the gentleman in the back for $75. Wesley paid in cash, 3 20s, a 10, and a 5, and walked away with a deed to a property he'd never even been inside. When he got home and told Paige what he'd done, she stared at him for a long moment before bursting into laughter. Not mocking laughter, but the kind that comes from shock and absurdity and maybe a tiny seed of hope. Dad, she said when she could breathe again, did you actually just buy a haunted mansion for the price of a decent dinner? I bought us a home, Wesley said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. They drove out to see it the next morning, Benson panting happily in the back seat. Old Mill Road was barely paved, more potholes than asphalt, lined with pine trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The mansion appeared suddenly, like something emerging from a dream or a nightmare, depending on your perspective. It was enormous, 3 stories of weathered clapboard and peeling paint, with a wraparound porch that sagged in places and a tower room on the western corner that listed slightly to one side. The windows were intact, but so dirty they looked opaque. The yard was a jungle of waist-high grass and wild rose bushes that had long since escaped any notion of cultivation. "Oh, my God," Paige whispered. Wesley's heart sank. In the harsh light of day, his impulsive purchase looked less like opportunity and more like the final mistake of a man who'd lost his ability to think clearly. But then Benson leaped out of the car and went bounding through the grass, tail wagging furiously, and something about the dog's pure joy made Wesley square his shoulders. Let's see what we've got," he said. The front door was unlocked. There was nothing left inside worth stealing. They stepped into a grand foyer with a curved staircase and dirty parquet floors that might have been beautiful once. Dust hung in the air like fog. The rooms sprawled in all directions, more space than Wesley had ever lived in, more space than seemed possible from the outside. Paige walked through slowly, her footsteps echoing. "It's like a time capsule," she said softly. "Look at this woodwork. And the stained glass." She pointed to a window on the landing where afternoon light filtered through panels of colored glass, throwing patches of amber and blue across the wall. Despite the decay, despite the years of neglect, there was beauty here, potential. They spent the afternoon exploring, discovering room after room. A library with built-in shelves and a fireplace. A dining room with a chandelier still hanging. A kitchen that would need complete gutting. Bedrooms on the second floor with views of the overgrown gardens. The tower room, which swayed slightly when you walked across it, but offered a vista of the entire property. "We could actually do this," Paige said as the sun began to set. She was standing in what might have been a music room, running her hand along a window frame. "It would take work, but we could make this livable." Wesley nodded, feeling that dangerous spark of hope again. Maybe he hadn't made a mistake. Maybe this was exactly what they needed. A project big enough to demand all their attention, to give them purpose beyond their individual griefs. They decided to move in immediately. There was no point paying rent on the Maple Street house when they owned this place, however improbable that ownership seemed. They packed their modest belongings, hired a truck for $50, and made the transition over one long weekend. Paige claimed a bedroom on the second floor that overlooked the garden. Wesley took a smaller room down the hall. They set up a camping stove in the kitchen and ran extension cords from the few outlets that still worked. It was rough, uncomfortable, and completely unsustainable long-term, but it was theirs. The first 2 days in the mansion passed in a blur of cleaning and discovery. Wesley and Paige worked with a focused intensity that felt almost therapeutic, scrubbing decades of grime from windows, sweeping out rooms that hadn't been touched in generations. Benson followed them everywhere, his nails clicking on the hardwood floors, occasionally stopping to sniff at corners or bark at shadows that might have been mice or might have been nothing at all. Wesley found himself waking early each morning with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in months. There was always something to do, always another room to explore, another repair to assess. The mansion was overwhelming in its needs, but that was oddly comforting. He could lose himself in the work, in the simple logic of fixing what was broken. On the third morning, Wesley woke to birdsong filtering through his window. The sun was just cresting the trees, painting the overgrown yard in shades of gold and green. He lay in his sleeping bag for a moment, listening to the old house settle and creak around him, and felt something close to peace. Downstairs, he let Benson out the back door into what had once been a formal garden. The dog bounded into the tall grass with his usual enthusiasm, disappearing and reappearing as he traced invisible paths only he could understand. Wesley stood on the sagging porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the morning light change the character of the landscape. That's when Benson's behavior shifted. The dog had been running in wide, happy circles, but suddenly he stopped near the eastern edge of the property. His whole body went rigid, ears perked forward, tail straight out. Then he started barking, not the playful yips he made when chasing squirrels, but deep, urgent barks that carried a note of alarm. "Benson!" Wesley called. "What have you got, boy?" The dog didn't come. He stayed fixed in place, barking at something Wesley couldn't see, occasionally jumping up and pawing at the air. Wesley set down his coffee and made his way across the overgrown lawn, dew soaking through his sneakers. As he got closer, he realized Benson was focused on a structure he hadn't noticed during their initial explorations, a sunroom addition on the eastern side of the house, almost completely hidden by overgrown lilac bushes and climbing vines. The glass panels were so covered in grime and leaves that he'd mistaken it for just another section of wall. "Benson, quiet," Wesley said, reaching for the dog's collar. But Benson pulled away, circling around to press his nose against one of the lower windows, whining now instead of barking. Wesley approached the window, intending to pull the dog back toward the house. He cupped his hands against the glass to peer inside, expecting to see nothing but an empty, abandoned room. Instead, he saw a woman. She was standing about 10 feet back from the window, perfectly still, her dark hair pulled into a loose braid over one shoulder. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a faded grey sweater despite the summer heat. Her face was pale, angular, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion or illness or both. She wasn't looking at the window. She was looking directly at Wesley. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Wesley's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. A person, a living person inside his house, inside a room he hadn't known existed. The rational part of his brain tried to supply explanations. A squatter, a homeless person seeking shelter, someone who'd been living here before he bought the place. But the way she stood there, so calm and still, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, made all rational thought scatter. "Hello," Wesley called, his voice cracking slightly. "Can you hear me?" The woman didn't respond. She took one slow step backward, then another, moving deeper into the shadows of the interior hallway beyond the sunroom. Within seconds, she disappeared completely. Wesley's heart was hammering now. He stepped back from the window, nearly tripping over Benson, who was still whining and pawing at the glass. His hands were shaking. He needed to think, needed to figure out what to do, but his mind was racing in too many directions at once. "Dad?" Wesley spun around to find Paige standing in the backyard, still in her pajamas, squinting in the morning light. "What's going on?" "I heard Benson barking. There's someone in the house," Wesley said, the words tumbling out. "A woman. I just saw her through the window." Paige's expression shifted instantly, from sleepy confusion to alarm. "What? Where?" Wesley pointed toward the sunroom. "In there!" She was just standing there, watching me, and then she walked away. Paige moved closer, peering at the structure half hidden by vegetation. "I didn't even know that room was there." "Neither did I." They stood together, both staring at the dirty windows, as if the woman might reappear. Benson had finally stopped barking, but remained alert, his attention fixed on the sunroom. "Did she look dangerous?" Paige asked quietly. Wesley thought about the woman's face, the tired eyes, the way she'd simply stepped back into the shadows rather than running. "No," he said slowly. "She looked scared. We should call the police." "Maybe." Wesley ran a hand through his hair, trying to think clearly. "Let's find a way inside first. See what we're dealing with." They circled the mansion, Benson leading the way, until they found a door on the eastern side they'd assumed was a closet during their initial exploration. Wesley tried the handle, locked from the inside. He pressed his ear against the door, listening but heard nothing. "There has to be another entrance," Paige said, her voice tight with tension. They found it in the library, hidden behind a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf that turned out to be a door on concealed hinges. Wesley pulled it open slowly, revealing a narrow hallway that led toward the eastern wing. Dust hung thick in the air, but there were footprints in it. Recent ones, delicate, belonging to someone who'd walked this path many times. Wesley's throat tightened. Someone had been living here, moving through the house while he and Paige slept. The thought should have terrified him, but instead he felt a strange mixture of fear and sadness. Whoever this woman was, she'd been hiding in an abandoned mansion. That spoke of desperation, not malice. "Dad," Paige whispered, gripping his arm. "Maybe we should call someone." "This is crazy." "I know," Wesley said, but he didn't reach for his phone. Instead, he stepped into the hallway, Paige and Benson following close behind. The corridor opened into the sunroom, where Wesley had seen the woman. It was a beautiful space, despite the neglect. Glass walls on 3 sides, a tile floor with an intricate floral pattern, wrought iron furniture still arranged around a small table. But what caught Wesley's attention were the signs of occupancy. A sleeping bag rolled neatly in one corner, a stack of books, a portable camping stove, sketch pads and drawing supplies arranged carefully on a shelf. And on the windowsill, positioned exactly where the woman had been standing, sat a small porcelain bird. It was exquisitely detailed, hand-painted in shades of blue and gray, perched on a tiny branch. The paint was fresh, the craftsmanship extraordinary. Paige picked it up carefully, turning it over in her hands. "Someone made this recently." Wesley walked through the sunroom, into the connecting hallway, finding more evidence of habitation. A makeshift bathroom set up with jugs of water, clothes hanging from a line strung between old pipes. Everything was neat, organized, almost fastidiously clean. This wasn't someone destructive or careless. This was someone trying to live invisibly, leaving as small a footprint as possible. "Dad, look at this," Paige called from the sunroom. She was holding one of the sketch pads. Wesley came back and looked over her shoulder at drawings of remarkable skill. Detailed renderings of the mansion's architecture, studies of plants from the garden, portraits of birds and small animals. Every page showed the work of someone with serious artistic talent. "Whoever she is," Paige said softly, "she's been here a while. Months, maybe." Wesley nodded, staring at the empty hallway where the woman had disappeared. "And we just invaded her home." They stood in silence, the weight of that realization settling over them. The mansion wasn't just theirs. Someone else had been living here, had made this place her refuge, and now they had to decide what to do about it. Wesley and Paige stood in the sunroom for a long time after discovering the signs of habitation, neither quite sure what to do. The morning light streamed through the dirty glass, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. Benson had settled down near the sleeping bag, resting his chin on his paws. occasionally glancing toward the doorway where the woman had vanished. "We can't just pretend we didn't see her," Paige said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. "No," Wesley agreed. "But calling the police feels wrong too. Why?" "She's trespassing. We own this house now." Wesley picked up one of the sketch pads again, flipping through pages of careful drawings. "Do we, though? We've been here 3 days. She's been here for months, maybe longer. Who's the real trespasser?" Paige crossed her arms, her expression troubled. "That's not how property law works, Dad." "I know." Wesley set the sketch pad down carefully, exactly where he'd found it. "But she hasn't heard anything. Look at this place. It's cleaner than most of the house. She's been taking care of it." They decided to wait. It felt like the only reasonable option in a situation that defied reason. They retreated to the main part of the house, leaving the hidden door open, and tried to go about their day as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Wesley found himself constantly aware of the sealed wing, wondering if the woman was still there, if she was watching them, if she was afraid. He couldn't focus on the repairs he'd planned. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, searching for information about squatters' rights and trespassing laws. The legal landscape was complicated, varying by state and circumstance. If someone had been living on a property openly for a certain period, they might have some legal claim. But this woman had been hiding, which changed things. Probably. Paige made phone calls to friends, asking hypothetical questions about what you should do if you found someone living in your house. The responses ranged from immediate calls to law enforcement to suggestions that she was crazy for not having called already. Nobody offered the answer Wesley wanted to hear, that there was a simple, compassionate solution that wouldn't involve police or eviction or the complex machinery of law. The afternoon dragged on. Benson kept returning to the hidden door, sitting nearby as if keeping vigil. Wesley watched the dog and felt an unexpected kinship with the animal's patience, his willingness to simply wait and see what might happen. As evening approached, Wesley made a decision. He prepared a simple meal, canned soup heated on their camping stove, slices of bread, a thermos of coffee. He arranged everything on a tray with paper plates and plastic utensils. Paige watched him from the doorway. "What are you doing?" "Offering hospitality," Wesley said simply. "Dad, this is insane. You don't know anything about this woman. She could be dangerous." Wesley met his daughter's eyes. "Does she seem dangerous to you?" "Honestly." Paige hesitated, then shook her head slowly. "No, she seems scared. But that doesn't mean—" "I know it doesn't mean we're safe," Wesley interrupted gently. "But it does mean she's human. And humans need to eat." He carried the tray to the hidden door and set it carefully on the floor just inside the threshold. He didn't call out or try to see into the darkened hallway. He simply left the food and walked away. Paige thought he was being naive. She said so, multiple times, as they prepared their own dinner and ate in the library, with the door open so they could watch the hallway. Wesley didn't argue with her. Maybe she was right. Maybe he was projecting his own desperation onto a stranger, seeing in her isolation something that mirrored his own sense of being lost and unwanted. But he couldn't shake the image of her face in the window, the stillness, the exhaustion, the absence of aggression or threat. She'd been standing there like someone who'd run out of places to run. They stayed up later than usual that night, both too wired to sleep. Paige scrolled through her phone. Wesley pretended to read a book he'd found in the library. Round midnight, Benson got up from his spot by the fireplace and trotted toward the hidden door. Wesley's heart quickened, but he forced himself to remain still, to let whatever was going to happen simply happen. 5 minutes passed. Then Benson returned, tail wagging slightly, and settled back into his spot. Wesley waited another few minutes, then got up as casually as he could manage and walked to the hallway. The tray was gone. In its place sat the empty bowl and plate carefully stacked, with the thermos and cup arranged neatly beside them. And tucked under the edge of the plate was a small piece of paper, torn from one of the sketch pads. Wesley picked it up. The handwriting was careful, elegant. "Thank you." He showed it to Paige. She stared at the note for a long moment, her expression softening despite her obvious desire to remain skeptical. Okay, she said quietly. So she has manners. That's something. They slept fitfully that night, or at least Wesley did. He kept waking at small sounds, wondering if the woman was moving through the house, if she felt trapped now that they knew she was there, if she was planning to leave entirely. Each time he woke, he considered getting up, trying to talk to her, but he stopped himself. Patience, he thought. Give her time. The next morning, Wesley left another tray of food. Breakfast this time, with a thermos of hot tea and a banana. He also left a note of his own, written on the back of an old receipt. We're not going to call the police. Take your time. The tray was retrieved within an hour. No note in return, but Wesley took its absence as acceptance of the truce he was offering. This became their routine over the next several days. Wesley left food twice a day. The dishes were always returned clean. Occasionally there would be a brief note, thank you, or the soup was good, but nothing more substantial. No name, no explanation, no request for conversation. Paige remained wary, but gradually accepted the arrangement. This is the weirdest situation I've ever been in, she said one morning, watching Wesley prepare yet another tray. We're basically running a bed and breakfast for a ghost. She's not a ghost, Wesley said. She's just scared. Of what? I don't know. But I remember what it feels like to want to hide from the world. To feel like there's no place for you anymore. Paige was quiet for a moment, then put her hand on his shoulder. You know we can't do this forever, right? Eventually, we'll have to actually talk to her. Find out who she is and what she wants. I know, Wesley said. But not yet. Let her come to us when she's ready. On the 5th morning, Wesley woke to find a piece of paper slipped under his bedroom door. For a moment he just stared at it, his heart racing. Then he picked it up, hands trembling slightly. The handwriting was the same careful script. My name is Delaine. Thank you for the soup. Thank you for your kindness. I'm sorry for intruding in your home. Wesley sat on the edge of his bed, reading the note 3 times. A name, she'd given him her name. It felt like a gift, like the beginning of something that might eventually become understanding. He showed the note to Paige over breakfast. She read it silently, then looked up at her father. Delaine, she said softly, testing the name. At least now she's not just the woman in the house. That afternoon, Paige surprised Wesley by leaving her own note with the lunch tray. Hi, Delaine. I'm Paige. Do you need anything? We have extra blankets if you're cold. The response came that evening. I'm okay. But thank you, Paige. Your kindness means more than you know. The note exchange continued for another week, each message slightly longer than the last, each one revealing small pieces of information. Delaine had been living in the sealed wing since March. She was careful not to use much electricity or water. She'd been surviving on very little, supplementing what she had with occasional trips to town when she knew the house was empty. She apologized repeatedly for the intrusion, for the disruption, for existing in their space. Wesley found himself thinking about her constantly. Who was this woman who lived like a ghost in the walls of his house? What had driven her to seek shelter in an abandoned mansion? The questions multiplied, but he resisted the urge to demand answers. She would tell them when she was ready, or she wouldn't. Either way, he felt an unexpected sense of responsibility for her well-being. Paige had softened considerably over the days. She started leaving little extras with the food trays, a chocolate bar, a paperback mystery novel, a small bottle of nice shampoo she'd bought in town. Each gift was acknowledged with grateful notes that grew increasingly personal. Delaine mentioned loving mysteries, thanked them for thinking of her comfort, asked how their repairs were going. It felt almost normal, this strange arrangement. Wesley and Paige worked on the house during the day, fixing broken shutters, patching holes in the plaster, clearing years of debris from the gutters. They could hear occasional sounds from the sealed wing, footsteps or the creak of furniture being moved, and they'd grown accustomed to the knowledge that they weren't alone. Benson had taken to sitting near the hidden door for hours at a time, his tail thumping gently whenever he heard movement from the other side. On the 10th day, Paige left a note asking if Delaine would be willing to meet face-to-face. We'd like to know you're okay, she wrote. No pressure, but we're here if you want to talk. The response came quickly. Soon, I promise. I'm just not ready yet. Wesley respected that, even as his curiosity grew sharper. He found himself leaving increasingly personal notes, sharing small details about his own life. He mentioned the divorce, the job loss, the feeling of starting over at an age when he'd expected to have things figured out. He wasn't sure why he was confessing these things to a stranger he'd never properly met, but somehow the distance made it easier. Delaine was real but abstract, present but unseen, like writing in a diary that occasionally wrote back. Her responses were equally personal. She mentioned having been a teacher once. She'd loved her work, but lost it under circumstances she didn't elaborate on. She talked about feeling like she'd disappointed everyone who'd ever believed in her, about the weight of shame and the desire to simply disappear. Wesley read her words and felt a painful recognition. They were both people who'd fallen through the cracks of their own lives. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday afternoon. Wesley was working in the library, organizing books and trying to assess the damage to the built-in shelves. Paige had gone into town to apply for jobs, and the house was quiet except for the usual settling sounds. Benson had been lying by the fireplace, but suddenly got up, ears perked, and trotted toward the hidden door. Wesley set down the book he was holding and watched. The dog disappeared into the hallway, and Wesley heard a sound he'd never heard before from that direction. Benson's happy whine, the one he made when greeting someone he knew and trusted. Wesley stood slowly, his heart hammering. He walked to the doorway but didn't enter the hallway. Instead, he waited, giving whoever was on the other side the choice of whether to proceed. A minute passed, then another. Then Benson emerged from the shadows, tail wagging, and behind him came Delaine. She moved slowly, hesitantly, like someone approaching a wild animal they didn't want to startle. In the better light of the library, Wesley could see her more clearly than through the sunroom window. She was probably in her early 40s, with dark hair streaked with grey that she'd pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her face was thin, making her cheekbones prominent, and her clothes hung loose on a frame that suggested she'd lost weight recently. But her eyes were what caught him, deep brown, intelligent, carrying a wariness that seemed bone deep. She stopped about 10 feet from where Wesley stood, her hand resting on Benson's head, as if the dog were an anchor keeping her steady. "Hello?" she said quietly. Her voice was softer than he'd expected, slightly hoarse from disuse. "Hello, Delaine," Wesley replied, keeping his own voice gentle. "I'm Wesley." She nodded, glancing around the library as if seeing it for the first time, though Wesley suspected she'd explored every inch of this house long before he arrived. "I didn't mean to intrude on your home," she said, the same words she'd written in her notes, but somehow more weighted when spoken aloud. "To be fair," Wesley said, echoing the phrase he'd thought many times, "you were here first." A flicker of something crossed her face, surprise, maybe, or relief. "The county auction," she said. "I saw the notice. I was going to leave before anyone moved in, but then," she paused, struggling with the words. "Something about you seemed kind. The way you talked to your daughter, the way you looked at the house, not like it was an investment or a project, but like it might be a home. And I thought maybe, just maybe, I could stay invisible a little longer." Wesley's chest tightened. "Why did you need to stay invisible?" Delaine was quiet for a long moment, her fingers moving through Benson's fur. "Because visible means vulnerable," she said finally. "And I'd been hurt enough." Before Wesley could respond, they heard the front door open. Paige's voice called out, "Dad, I'm back." Delaine tensed immediately, taking a half-step backward toward the hidden hallway. Wesley held up a hand in a calming gesture. "It's just Paige," he said. "She knows about you. She's the one who's been leaving you the chocolate and the books." Delaine's expression shifted slightly, softening. "She's kind too," she said. "Like her father." Paige appeared in the library doorway, her arms full of grocery bags. She froze when she saw Delaine, her eyes widening. For a moment nobody moved. Then Paige carefully set the bags down and took a cautious step forward. "Hi," she said. "I'm Paige." "Delaine," the other woman replied. The three of them stood in awkward tableau, none quite sure how to proceed. Benson, unburdened by human social uncertainty, simply wagged his tail and looked pleased that his favorite people were all in the same room. "Would you like some tea?" Paige asked suddenly. "I just bought some nice herbal stuff. And cookies. I got cookies too." It was such a normal, domestic offer that it seemed to break through Delaine's defenses. Her shoulders relaxed slightly and she nodded. "That would be nice," she said quietly. "Thank you." They moved to the kitchen together, maintaining a careful distance that acknowledged Delaine's skittishness. Paige put the kettle on the camping stove while Wesley cleared space at the table. Delaine sat down slowly, her hands folded in her lap, looking like someone who'd forgotten how to be in company with others. The tea was ready quickly. Paige served it in mismatched mugs they'd found in the cabinets, along with a plate of store-bought cookies that suddenly seemed inadequate to the moment. They sat together, the silence not quite comfortable, but not hostile either. "I found something yesterday," Delaine said abruptly, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out an old photograph, its edges worn and colors faded, behind a loose board in the sunroom. "I thought you should see it." She slid it across the table. Wesley picked it up, squinting at the image. It showed the mansion in what looked like the 1940s, well-maintained and beautiful, with a family posed on the front steps. A distinguished older man, a woman in a dress, and a younger woman who looked to be in her 20s. "That's Aldrich Pemberton," Delaine said, pointing to the older man. "He built this house, and that's his daughter, Constance." Wesley studied the younger woman's face and felt a jolt of recognition. "She looks like you," he said. Delaine nodded slowly. "She should," she said. "She was my great-grandmother." The photograph lay on the table between them, a bridge connecting past and present. Wesley stared at it, then at Delaine, seeing the resemblance more clearly now, the same angular features, the same deep-set eyes, even the same way of holding her head slightly tilted, as if perpetually listening for something just beyond hearing. "Your great-grandmother," Paige repeated slowly. "So you have a connection to this house?" "A complicated one," Delaine said, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "My grandmother, Constance's daughter, was born in 1939, but she was raised by distant relatives, never in this house. The family didn't acknowledge her officially. There were rumors, whispers about scandal, but my grandmother never talked about it much. She just said her mother had to leave, that the house held too much pain." Wesley leaned forward, fascinated despite himself. "What happened to Constance?" "Nobody knows for certain. The official story is that she disappeared in 1942, just vanished one night. Some people thought she'd been murdered, others that she'd run away. The house passed to other members of the Pemberton family, but they never stayed long. Eventually it was abandoned, and you came here because of that history?" Paige asked. Delaine was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "Not exactly. Or maybe yes, in a way I didn't fully understand at the time." She took a breath, seeming to gather courage. 3 years ago, my life fell apart. I was teaching art at a small high school, had been there for 12 years. I'd loved my students, loved my work, but I made a terrible mistake. She paused, and Wesley could see the cost of this confession in the tension around her eyes. He wanted to tell her she didn't have to continue, but he sensed she needed to say it, needed someone to hear her story without judgment. "I had an affair with another teacher," Delaine continued, her voice steady but soft. "He was married. I knew that, and I did it anyway. It was brief, stupid, the kind of thing that happens when you're lonely and someone pays attention to you and you forget that actions have consequences." She looked up at them, her eyes searching their faces. "When his wife found out, everything exploded. Small town, you know? Everyone knew within days. I lost my job, my friends, my reputation. People I'd known for years crossed the street to avoid me. Parents complained about having me near their children. I became the scandal, the cautionary tale." "That's awful," Paige said quietly. "But people make mistakes. That doesn't mean—" "I know," Delaine interrupted gently. "In my rational mind, I know that. But knowing something and feeling it are different things. The shame was crushing. I couldn't go to the grocery store without feeling everyone's eyes on me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I started having panic attacks just leaving my apartment." Wesley recognized the spiral she was describing, the way shame could become a prison more effective than any physical walls. "So you left," he said. "I fled," Delaine corrected. "Like a coward. I packed what I could fit in my car and just drove. I had some savings, not much, but enough to keep me going for a while. I moved from town to town, staying in cheap motels, picking up odd jobs when I could. But everywhere felt temporary, exposed. I couldn't settle anywhere because I couldn't stand the thought of people getting to know me, of having to explain my past or lie about it." She picked up the photograph again, looking at Constance's face. "I remembered my grandmother's stories about this house, about a woman who disappeared rather than face whatever she was running from. When I was a child, I thought it was romantic, mysterious. As an adult running from my own life, I understood it differently. So I came here last March, thinking I'd just see the place, maybe find some connection to family history. But the house was abandoned," Wesley said. "Completely empty. The county had seized it, but nobody was maintaining it. I broke a window to get inside, the one in the sunroom, and I found all these rooms, all this space where nobody was looking. It felt like fate. A place to hide where even my own shame couldn't find me." Paige reached across the table, stopping just short of touching Delaine's hand. "You've been living here alone since March. That's 5 months. 5 months of trying to be invisible," Delaine said. "I'd go into town once a week for supplies, always to different stores, always paying cash. I kept to the sealed wing, moved quietly, tried not to leave any trace. The house was big enough that I could pretend I was the only person in the world." "That sounds incredibly lonely," Wesley said. Delaine met his eyes, and he saw tears gathering there. "It was the loneliest I've ever been, but it also felt safe. Nobody could judge me, nobody could hurt me. I could just exist without having to be anyone." Wesley thought about his own isolation after the divorce, the way he'd withdrawn from friends and neighbors, unable to face their pity or their questions. He'd thought a few months of that was difficult. He couldn't imagine choosing that isolation for half a year, living like a ghost in someone else's space. "When we moved in," he said carefully, "you must have been terrified." "I was," Delaine admitted. "But I was also curious. You seemed lost, both of you, grieving something. I watched you those first days, saw how gentle you were with each other despite your obvious pain. And I thought maybe we weren't so different, the three of us, all hiding in our own ways." The kettle whistled on the camping stove. Paige got up to refill their mugs, and the small domestic action seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. When she sat back down, she looked at Delaine with a directness that reminded Wesley of his ex-wife, at her most perceptive. "Why did you stay after we moved in?" Paige asked. "You could have left that first day." Delaine considered the question, her fingers wrapped around the warm mug. "At first, fear. I didn't have anywhere else to go, and I'd built this fragile sense of safety here. But then your father left that first tray of food, and I realized he wasn't going to call the police, wasn't going to force me out immediately. And I got curious about what kind of people would do that, would show kindness to a stranger squatting in their house. So you watched us," Wesley said, not accusingly, but as a statement of fact. "I did. I'm sorry if that's creepy, but yes. I watched you work on the house together, heard your conversations. You talked about your divorce, Wesley, about feeling like you'd failed. You talked about your broken engagement, Paige, about losing your whole social circle when your relationship ended. And I felt this strange kinship. We were all refugees from our old lives, all trying to figure out how to start over." Wesley exchanged a glance with Paige. He could see his daughter processing this information, weighing the strangeness of being observed against the vulnerability of Delaine's confession. "I need to ask you something," Paige said finally, "and I need you to be honest. Do you have any legal claim to this house? Through your family connection?" The question hung in the air. Delaine's expression shifted, becoming guarded again, and Wesley felt his stomach tighten. She was going to say yes. He could see it in her face. "I don't know," Delaine said slowly. "I've wondered about it. My grandmother was Aldrich Pemberton's granddaughter, though not officially recognized. If Constance was the last direct heir, and she disappeared without a will, the inheritance would have been contested. But that was 80 years ago. I have no idea if there's any legal standing left." But you've thought about it, Paige pressed. Of course I have, Delaine said, a flash of defensive anger crossing her face. I've been homeless and desperate. Yes, I've wondered if I had any right to this place beyond breaking in through a window. But I've never pursued it because I don't have money for lawyers, and honestly, I'm too ashamed to face any official scrutiny. My name in public records, questions about my past, I can't handle that. Wesley believed her. He could hear the truth in her voice, the exhaustion of someone who'd been running too long. So what do you want? He asked gently. Right now, in this moment, what do you actually want? Delaine looked at him, then at Paige, then down at her hands. I want to stop running, she said quietly. I want to feel like I belong somewhere again. But I don't know if that's possible. Over the following weeks, a tentative rhythm developed among the three of them. Delaine continued to sleep in the sealed wing. She said she wasn't ready to fully integrate into the main house, that she needed a space that was still hers alone. But she spent her days working alongside Wesley and Paige on repairs. Her knowledge of the house's hidden architecture proved invaluable. She showed them passages they'd never have discovered, explained the logic of the Victorian-era construction, and revealed spaces that had been sealed off for decades. She was also, they discovered, remarkably skilled with her hands. She could restore damaged woodwork, mix paint to match original colors, and repair plaster with a precision that suggested years of practice. When Wesley asked about it, she explained that she'd renovated her grandmother's house years ago, learning by trial and error. I always loved working with my hands, she said one afternoon, as they stripped wallpaper in what had once been a formal dining room. Teaching art was wonderful, but there's something satisfying about physical restoration. You can see the progress. You can't mess it up with words or emotions. Paige had warmed to Delaine considerably, though Wesley noticed his daughter still maintained a certain watchfulness, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. They worked well together, falling into an easy partnership when organizing supplies or planning projects. Delaine helped Paige revise her resume, offering suggestions that came from her own teaching experience, and Paige started landing interviews for administrative positions at schools in neighboring towns. Wesley found himself drawn to Delaine in ways that both comforted and unsettled him. It wasn't romantic, or at least he told himself it wasn't, but rather a recognition of shared damage. They were both people who'd built lives that collapsed, who'd lost their sense of place in the world. In the evenings, after Paige went to bed, they often sat in the library drinking tea and talking about everything and nothing. She told him about her students, the ones she'd loved teaching, the guilt she carried about abandoning them. He told her about his years on the assembly line, about watching his marriage slowly die without knowing how to save it. One night, about 3 weeks after their first real conversation, Delaine mentioned something that shifted Wesley's understanding of everything. I need to show you something, she said, setting down her tea. I should have shown you weeks ago, but I was afraid. She led him and Paige back to the sealed wing, to a section they'd explored only briefly. Behind a panel in one of the small bedrooms, she revealed a cavity in the wall. Inside was a metal box, old but well preserved. I found this my second week here, Delaine said, carefully removing the box. I've been afraid to share it because of what it might mean. She opened it to reveal a collection of letters, yellowed with age, tied with a faded ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes was elegant, old-fashioned. Delaine untied the ribbon carefully and handed the first letter to Wesley. They're love letters, she said quietly, between my great-grandmother Constance and a man named Samuel Thorne. They're dated from 1937 to 1942. Wesley unfolded the first letter, handling it gently. The paper was fragile, the ink faded, but still legible. He read aloud, My dearest Constance, every moment away from you feels like a small death. Your father's objections mean nothing to me. I would wait a lifetime if it meant 1 more hour in your presence. I am yours completely and eternally, Samuel. Paige took the next letter, reading silently before looking up with wide eyes. They were planning to elope, she said. Look at this one, from August 1942. He says they should leave on September 1st, that he's saved enough money for them to start over in Oregon. Delaine nodded, her expression somber. But there are no letters after August 15th, 1942, and that's when Constance disappeared. They spent the next hour reading through the correspondence, piecing together a story of forbidden love and family opposition. Constance's father, Aldrich Pemberton, had deemed Samuel unsuitable. He was working class, with no family connections or prospects that met the Pemberton standards. The letters revealed increasingly desperate plans to escape, to build a life somewhere the family's reach couldn't extend. "My grandmother told me fragments of this story," Delaine said when they'd finished reading. "She said Constance's family discovered the elopement plan and confined her to the house. Samuel came to get her anyway, and there was some kind of confrontation. Constance ran, just fled into the night, and was never seen again." "What happened to Samuel?" Paige asked. "He spent years searching for her. My grandmother said he never married, never stopped looking. He died in 1967, still believing she was alive somewhere." Wesley set down the letters carefully, his mind working through the implications. "So your grandmother was born before all of this happened?" "Before Constance disappeared. In 1939, Delaine confirmed. The family sent the baby away to be raised by cousins. There was never any official acknowledgement that Constance had a child. I think that's part of why the inheritance got so messy after the family died out." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the tragic history settling over them. Wesley thought about Constance running into the night, choosing disappearance over the life her family demanded. He thought about Delaine making the same choice 80 years later, fleeing to the same house where her ancestor had been trapped. "You came here looking for her story," Wesley said, understanding clicking into place. "Not just shelter. You were looking for what happened to her." Delaine nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "I've been obsessed with her since I was a child. The woman who disappeared, who chose freedom over everything else. When my own life fell apart, I thought maybe I could understand her better if I stood where she'd stood, lived where she'd lived." "Have you?" Paige asked gently. "Do you understand her better?" "I think so," Delaine said slowly. "I think she wasn't running from love or even from her family. She was running from shame, from the judgment that came with defying expectations, and I think she probably spent the rest of her life hiding, just like I have." "Just like I am." Wesley felt his chest tighten with recognition. "You think disappearing was a mistake. I think it was the only choice she felt she had," Delaine said. "But yes, I think it was a mistake. Because you can't build a life in hiding. You can only survive, and barely that." Paige reached over and took Delaine's hand, a gesture of comfort that surprised Wesley with its naturalness. His daughter had grown attached to this woman, he realized. They both had. "You're not hiding anymore," Paige said firmly. "You're here with us." "That's different, is it?" Delaine asked, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm still living in the shadows, still afraid to go into town, to use my real name anywhere official. Still running from a past that's going to catch up with me eventually." Wesley stood up, pacing to the window. Outside, the overgrown garden was barely visible in the darkness. He thought about the county auction, about his impulsive $75 bid, about how he'd told himself he was buying a house, but had really been buying an escape from his own shame and failure. "Maybe we're all running," he said, turning back to face them. "But maybe that's okay as long as we're running together. As long as we're not alone with it." Delaine looked at him, something shifting in her expression. Hope, maybe, or the first tentative belief that hiding might not be her only option. "I want to believe that," she said quietly. "But I'm afraid I've done too much damage to ever have a real life again." "Then you'll fit right in with us," Paige said with a weak smile. "We're a mansion full of damaged people trying to figure out how to be whole." It should have been depressing, but somehow it wasn't. Somehow, in that moment, it felt like the beginning of something that might eventually resemble healing. A month passed in relative peace. The house slowly transformed under their combined efforts, rooms emerging from decay into something approaching livability. Wesley found steady work at the hardware store in town, enough to cover food and supplies. Paige landed a part-time position at an elementary school, helping in the front office 3 days a week. Delaine continued her careful balance, working on the house during the day, retreating to her sealed wing at night, slowly becoming more visible without quite stepping fully into the light. Wesley had begun to think they might actually make this work, this strange household of broken people finding something like family. Then the lawyer arrived. It was a Tuesday afternoon, unseasonably warm for late September. Wesley was replacing rotted boards on the front porch when a silver sedan pulled up the long driveway. A man in his 50s emerged, carrying a leather briefcase, his suit slightly rumpled from the drive. "Wesley Banks?" he called out. Wesley set down his hammer, wiping sawdust from his hands. "That's me." The man approached, extending a business card. "Marcus Sutherland, property law attorney. I need to speak with you about this house." Wesley's stomach dropped. He took the card, reading it without really seeing the words. "What about it? May we speak inside?" They moved to the library, where Sutherland settled into one of the chairs they'd salvaged and cleaned. Wesley sat across from him, his mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. "Mr. Banks, I represent a client who has filed a legal challenge to the county auction sale of this property. They claim rightful inheritance through family lineage that was never properly resolved. I'm here to inform you that the sale may be invalidated pending a court hearing." Wesley felt the room tilt slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means you may lose ownership of this property. If my client's claim is validated, the county auction will be deemed improper and you'll be refunded your purchase price. But you'll need to vacate the premises." "Who's your client?" Sutherland's expression remained professionally neutral. "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information at this time. The hearing is scheduled for 6 weeks from today. You'll receive official notification by mail within a few days. I'm here as a courtesy to give you advance warning." After Sutherland left, Wesley sat in the library for a long time, the business card still in his hand. All of this, the work, the hope, the fragile sense of purpose he'd begun to rebuild, was about to be taken away. He should have known better. He should have known that $75 was too good to be true, that there were no real second chances, only temporary reprieves from inevitable failure. Paige came home an hour later and found him still sitting there. He told her about Sutherland's visit, watching her face cycle through disbelief, anger, and despair. "We can fight this," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "We can hire a lawyer, contest the claim." "With what money?" Wesley asked quietly. "We're barely keeping ourselves fed. There are free legal services. We can research property law ourselves. We can—" She stopped, seeming to run out of options. "We can't just give up." "I'm not giving up," Wesley said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "I just need to understand what we're dealing with first." He went looking for Delaine, needing to tell her they might all be homeless soon, needing her calm presence to anchor him. He found the sealed wing empty. Her belongings were still there, but she wasn't. He checked the other rooms, calling her name, growing increasingly anxious. He found her in the sunroom, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, her knees drawn up to her chest. She was crying, not the gentle tears he'd seen when she talked about her past, but harsh, broken sobs that shook her whole body. "Delaine!" Wesley knelt beside her, alarmed. "What's wrong?" She couldn't speak at first, just shook her head and pressed her palms against her eyes. Wesley waited, his hand hovering near her shoulder but not quite touching, giving her space to compose herself. Finally, she lowered her hands and looked at him, her face blotchy and wet with tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. For what? What happened?"
"The lawyer," she said, her voice breaking.
"Sutherland. He's my lawyer. I'm the one filing the claim." Wesley felt like he'd been punched in the chest. He sat back on his heels, staring at her, trying to process what she'd just said. "You're claiming the house? I filed the claim in June before you bought it. Before I even knew you existed." The words tumbled out desperately. "I'd been living here for months, and I started researching the property history, the family connection. I found evidence that the inheritance was never properly settled, that as Constance's descendant, I might have a legal claim. I was homeless and desperate, and I thought maybe I had some right to this place. So you hired a lawyer, a friend of a friend who does some pro bono work. He said the case had merit, started the paperwork. By the time you bought the house at auction, the legal process was already moving forward. I didn't know how to stop it, didn't know if I should. Wesley stood up abruptly, needing distance. You've known this whole time. Every conversation, every meal we shared, every time you helped us work on this house, you knew you were trying to take it from us. No! Delaine scrambled to her feet, reaching toward him. At first, yes. At first, it was just about the house, about having somewhere that was mine. But then I met you, both of you, and everything changed. I stopped caring about ownership. I just wanted, her voice broke again, I just wanted to belong somewhere, with people who didn't know my past, who saw me as a person instead of a scandal. But you didn't tell us. Wesley's voice was harder than he'd intended. You let us work on this house, let us believe we had a future here, and you never said anything. I was afraid, Delaine cried. Every day I wanted to tell you, and every day I was terrified you'd hate me, that you'd throw me out, that I'd lose the only good thing in my life. I kept telling myself I'd withdraw the claim, but I was scared that without it, I'd have no legal right to be here at all. I was paralyzed by fear and shame, and she stopped, wiping her eyes roughly. And cowardice. I was a coward. Paige appeared in the doorway, having heard the raised voices. She looked at Delaine, then at Wesley, reading the situation immediately. What's going on? Wesley couldn't speak. He just shook his head and walked past his daughter, needing air, needing space to think. Behind him, he heard Delaine trying to explain, heard Paige's shocked response escalating into anger. He went outside, walking until he reached the edge of the property where the overgrown grass met the tree line. Benson had followed him and sat nearby, patient and loyal, in the way only dogs could be. Wesley tried to organize his thoughts, but they kept fragmenting. Betrayal, understanding, anger, empathy. Delaine had lied by omission, had let them invest in a future she knew might not exist. But she'd also been desperate, alone, making survival decisions from a place of fear. He thought about the letters from Constance and Samuel, about people trapped by circumstances and making choices that seemed reasonable in the moment, but led to tragedy. He thought about his own desperation at the county auction, bidding on a house with money he couldn't afford to lose because he needed something, anything, to feel like a lifeline. When he returned to the house an hour later, he found Paige and Delaine in the kitchen. Paige was furious, pacing and gesturing, her voice sharp with betrayal. Delaine sat at the table, her face in her hands, not defending herself. She used us, Paige said when she saw Wesley. She manipulated us into caring about her while she was stealing our home. I'm withdrawing the claim, Delaine said quietly, not looking up. I called Sutherland before you came back. I'm dropping it completely. The house is yours. That's not the point, Paige snapped. The point is you lied. For weeks you pretended to be our friend while hiding this. Wesley watched them both, feeling older than his 46 years. Delaine, he said finally, look at me. She raised her head slowly, her eyes red and swollen. Did you mean it? He asked. When you said you stopped caring about the house? Yes, she whispered. I stopped caring about owning it the moment I realized I might lose you both. But I didn't know how to tell you without destroying everything. So you chose to say nothing. I chose wrong, Delaine said. I always choose wrong. I'm sorry. I'll pack my things and leave tonight. I'll make sure Sutherland files the withdrawal immediately. You won't have to see me again. She stood and walked toward the sealed wing. Wesley watched her go, feeling something tear inside his chest, anger and grief tangled together so tightly he couldn't separate them. Paige turned to him, tears streaming down her face. How could she do this to us? After everything? Wesley didn't have an answer. He just pulled his daughter into a hug and held on while they both tried to understand how trust could break so completely and so quietly. Delaine left that evening. Wesley and Paige heard her moving through the sealed wing, gathering her few belongings, but neither of them went to her. They sat in the library in heavy silence, listening to footsteps and the quiet sounds of someone dismantling the only home she'd had in months. When the front door finally closed and her car started in the driveway, Benson whined and paced to the window, watching the taillights disappear down the long road. The house felt immediately emptier. Wesley tried to tell himself it was relief. The situation had been resolved, the legal threat removed. They could move forward without complications. But it didn't feel like relief. It felt like loss, sharp and unexpected. 3 weeks passed. Sutherland sent official documentation confirming that the claim had been withdrawn. The county sent a letter stating that the auction sale stood as final. The house was legally, unquestionably theirs. Wesley should have felt triumphant, but instead he felt hollow. They continued working on repairs, but the rhythm was off without Delaine's presence. Projects she'd been managing sat unfinished. Wesley would reach for a tool and remember she'd been the one who knew where it was kept. Paige would start to call out a question about paint colors and stop mid-sentence, realizing the person she wanted to ask was gone. They didn't talk about her directly. Instead, they worked in silence, broken only by necessary communication about the tasks at hand. Wesley threw himself into the physical labor, exhausting himself daily so he wouldn't lie awake at night, thinking about the look on Delaine's face when she'd said goodbye. Not angry or defensive, just resigned, like she'd always known this was how it would end. Paige secured a full-time position at the elementary school and threw herself into the work with similar intensity. She came home tired and went straight to bed, avoiding the rooms where they'd shared meals and conversations with Delaine. Wesley understood. His daughter was protecting herself, building walls against further hurt. But he also saw the cost of those walls. Paige was withdrawing again, becoming the quiet, careful version of herself she'd been right after Connor's betrayal. The woman who'd slowly emerged over the summer, more open, more willing to trust, was disappearing back into protective silence. One evening, nearly a month after Delaine left, Paige came to Wesley with her laptop open to a legal forum. "I've been researching property law," she said without preamble. "Delaine's claim might have been legitimate." Wesley looked up from the book he wasn't really reading. "What do you mean?" "If she could prove direct lineage from Constance Pemberton, and if Constance was the rightful heir who disappeared before the property could be properly transferred, then Delaine might actually have inherited claim. The auction might have been improper. Sutherland already withdrew the case, I know. But what if she gave up something she actually had a right to? What if we let her walk away from her own inheritance?" Wesley set down his book. "Why does it matter now?" Paige was quiet for a moment, staring at the screen. "Because I've been angry for 3 weeks and I'm tired of it. Because every time I walk past the sunroom, I remember her sitting there painting, and I miss her. Because maybe she made a mistake, but so have we. So have I." Wesley felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he hadn't realized had been tightening. "You want to find her?" "I want to know she's okay," Paige said. "And I want to know the truth about the inheritance. If she had a legitimate claim and gave it up for us, that changes things. Doesn't it?" It did. Wesley had been trying not to think about it. But if Delaine had sacrificed a legal right to the property because she valued their relationship more than ownership, that reframed everything. It wasn't manipulation, it was the opposite. It was choosing people over security, connection over survival. "I don't know how to find her," Wesley said. "She never told us where she was from originally. She mentioned a small town 3 hours north once, remember? When she was talking about the scandal that made her leave. And in those letters, Samuel's last name was Thorne. I searched for that name in northern towns and found a Samuel Thorne, who lived in Millfield until 1967. Wesley felt his pulse quicken. "That's a long shot. It's the only shot we have." They decided to go the next day, a Saturday when neither of them had work obligations. Wesley barely slept that night, rehearsing what he might say, trying to prepare for the possibility that Delaine wouldn't want to see them, or worse, that they wouldn't find her at all. Before they left, Wesley found himself drawn to the sealed wing. He hadn't entered it since Delaine left, but now he pushed open the hidden door and walked through the rooms she'd occupied. Most of her belongings were gone, but small traces remained. A sketch pad forgotten on a shelf, a chipped mug she'd used for tea, a blanket folded neatly in the corner. In the sunroom, propped against the wall, was a canvas he hadn't seen before. It was a painting of the mansion's garden, but not as it currently existed, as it could be. The overgrown wilderness had been transformed into organized beauty, with paths and flower beds and places to sit. And in the painting, 3 figures stood together among the flowers, their faces turned toward each other, their postures suggesting conversation and ease. Wesley stared at the painting for a long time, understanding what Delaine had been imagining, not just a restored house, but a restored life, a place where people belonged together. He carried the canvas downstairs and showed it to Paige. She touched it gently, her eyes filling with tears. She was painting what she wanted, she said quietly. A home. With us. They left an hour later, Benson in the back seat, the painting carefully wrapped and placed in the trunk. The drive north took them through changing landscape, towns growing smaller and more worn as they left the city's orbit. Millfield appeared exactly as Delaine had suggested. A place visibly struggling, its main street showing more closed businesses than open ones. They stopped at a diner that looked like it had been serving the same menu since 1970. The waitress, a woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and tired feet, recognized Paige's description of Delaine immediately. "Oh, you mean Dell," she said. "Quiet lady, keeps to herself. Lives in the old Thorn cottage out on Pinewood Road. Poor thing, looks like she hasn't had a good meal in months. Always orders the cheapest thing on the menu." She gave them directions, and they drove slowly through neighborhoods that had seen better decades. The Thorn cottage sat at the end of a rutted dirt road, a small structure that might have been charming once, but now sagged with neglect. Paint peeled from the siding, and the yard was nothing but dirt and weeds. Wesley's heart sank. This was where Delaine had come, after leaving the mansion, from one form of hiding to another, but this one looked far more desolate. They sat in the car for 10 minutes, neither quite ready to knock on the door. What if she didn't want to see them? What if their presence only reminded her of another failure, another loss? "We came all this way," Paige said finally. "We have to at least try." Wesley nodded and got out of the car. As he approached the cottage, the front door opened. Delaine stood in the doorway, and for a moment they just stared at each other across the overgrown yard. She looked thinner than when she'd left, if that was possible. Her hair hung loose and uncombed, and she wore clothes that seemed too large. But it was her expression that broke Wesley's heart, a mixture of hope and fear so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Oh, Wesley," she said quietly. "Paige, what are you doing here?" "We came to talk," Wesley said, finding his voice. "If you're willing to listen." Delaine nodded slowly, stepping back to let them inside. The cottage was sparse and cold, with minimal furniture and no personal touches. It felt temporary, like a place where someone was waiting rather than living. They sat together in the small front room, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Finally, Paige spoke. "We found Constance's diary," she said, "hidden in a passage you'd shown us. We didn't discover it until after you left." Delaine's eyes widened. Her diary? I searched for months and never found it. It was behind a loose panel in a stairwell," Wesley said. "The final entries are from 1942, right before she disappeared." "What did they say?" Delaine's voice was barely a whisper. Paige pulled out photocopies they'd made. Wesley had insisted on leaving the original safely at the mansion. She wrote about her family discovering the elopement plan, about them locking her in the house. But the last entry is different. "It's not about being trapped. It's about choosing to leave," she read aloud. "Tonight I become no one. Tonight I am free. They think they can cage me with their shame and their rules, but I will disappear so completely that even my own name won't be able to find me." Delaine closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "She chose it. She chose to vanish. And we think she survived," Wesley added gently. "We found a newspaper article from 1945 about a woman matching her description, running a boarding house for women in Oregon. It might not be her, but it could be," Delaine finished. "She could have built a new life." The 3 of them sat in the dim cottage, the weight of Constance's story settling around them. Delaine held the photocopied diary pages with trembling hands, reading and rereading the final entry as if trying to absorb its meaning through her skin. She didn't just run from shame, Delaine said slowly. She ran toward something, toward the possibility of building a life on her own terms. That's what we think, Paige said, and we think maybe you did the same thing in a way. You came to the mansion looking for her story, but you were also looking for permission to disappear. Delaine looked up, her eyes questioning. Permission to let go of who you were supposed to be, Wesley said carefully. To stop carrying the weight of other people's judgment. Constance gave you a template for that. She disappeared and apparently survived, maybe even thrived. But I haven't thrived, Delaine said, her voice breaking. I've been hiding in abandoned houses and cheap cottages, barely surviving. That's not freedom. That's just slow disappearing. Wesley leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Delaine, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Did you have a legitimate legal claim to the mansion? She was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Sutherland thought so. He said if we could prove the lineage and show that the inheritance was never properly settled, I'd have a strong case. The county auction might have been premature, so you gave up something that was rightfully yours, Paige said. It wasn't mine, Delaine protested. Not really. Yes, technically, through blood and law, maybe I had some claim. But Wesley bought it fairly at a legal auction. He gave you both a home. I couldn't take that away, not after I'd watched what it meant to you. But what does it mean to you? Wesley pressed. That house, your great-grandmother lived there, was trapped there, ran from there. You've been connected to it your whole life through family stories. Don't you want to know what it could be if it was actually yours? If you didn't have to hide in the sealed wing, but could live in it fully? Delaine's face crumpled. Of course I want that, but I don't deserve it. I lied to you both. I let you believe we were friends while I was hiding this enormous secret. What kind of person does that? A scared one, Paige said quietly. A person who's been hurt so badly that trust feels impossible. I understand that better than you think. Wesley watched his daughter reach across the space between them and take Delaine's hand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. Paige choosing connection over self-protection, choosing to bridge the gap that anger had created. We've been thinking, Wesley said. What if there's another way to handle this? Not me owning the house, not you owning it, but something different. Delaine looked confused. I don't understand. What if we shared it? Paige said. What if we found a way to make the house belong to all of us? Not legally necessarily, but actually. A real home for people who need one. I can't ask you to do that, Delaine said, shaking her head. You paid for it. You've worked on it. It's yours. I paid $75, Wesley said with a slight smile. And without you, we'd never have known about half the hidden spaces, never have restored half of what we've managed. You've put as much into that house as we have. But the betrayal was real, Paige interrupted. And it hurt. But you know what hurt more? Watching you drive away. Missing your presence in the house, realizing that somewhere along the way you became family and we let you go without fighting for you. Delaine stared at them both, disbelief and hope warring in her expression. You came all this way to tell me this? We came to bring you home, Wesley said simply. If you want to come, if you're willing to stop hiding and try actually living again. I don't know if I can, Delaine whispered. I don't know if I remember how to do that. Neither do we, Paige admitted. We're all figuring it out as we go. But maybe that's the point. Maybe home isn't something you inherit or buy. Maybe it's something you build together with people who understand being broken. Wesley stood up, moving to the window where he could see their car parked in the weedy yard. Benson's face was pressed against the glass, watching the cottage with patient devotion. I've been thinking about something you said once, Wesley said, not turning around. About how the house remembered how to hold life. I didn't understand it then, but I think I do now. That house has been waiting for people who need it, who can give it purpose beyond just existing. Constance needed to leave it, but maybe you were meant to return to it, to finish what she started. He turned back to face Delaine. Come home with us, not to hide, not to disappear, but to build something. I don't know exactly what yet, but something that matters. Something that transforms all this pain into purpose. Delaine looked between them, tears streaming freely now. You really mean this? After everything? After everything, Paige confirmed. We want you to come home. The word hung in the air. Home. Not a house, not a property, not a place to hide, but home. A place of belonging, of acceptance, of second chances. Delaine took a shuddering breath. I need to tell you something first. Something I haven't told anyone. She reached for a box on the nearby shelf, pulling out papers. These are documents my grandmother left me. I've been too afraid to look at them closely, but if we're going to do this, if we're really going to try to build something together, you need to see them. She spread the papers on the small table. Wesley and Paige leaned in to look. It's the Pemberton family Bible, Delaine said, her voice shaking. With birth records, marriage records, everything. And it changes the whole story. Wesley stared at the family Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by generations of handling. Delaine opened it carefully to the pages where births and deaths had been recorded in various hands spanning decades. She pointed to an entry from 1939. This is my grandmother's birth record, she said. Constance Marie Pemberton gave birth to a daughter, Catherine Ann, on March 15, 1939. 3 years before Constance disappeared, Paige said, leaning closer. But look at the father's name, Delaine said, her finger trembling as it traced the faded ink. Wesley read aloud, Father, Harold Pemberton. The room went silent. Harold was listed elsewhere in the Bible as Aldrich's nephew, a second cousin to Constance. She was assaulted, Paige whispered, horror dawning in her eyes. Or coerced. That's why the family sent the baby away. That's why they covered it up. Delaine nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. My grandmother never knew the full story. She thought her mother had simply been unmarried and shamed. But this, she touched the entry gently. This explains why Constance was so desperate to escape. It wasn't just about forbidden love with Samuel. It was about surviving trauma and escaping the family that had either enabled it or blamed her for it. Wesley felt rage building in his chest, anger at people long dead who had imprisoned a traumatized young woman rather than protecting her. So when Samuel came to get her, she saw a way out, Delaine finished. Not just to be with the man she loved, but to escape the place where she'd been violated and then blamed for it. When her family tried to stop her, she didn't just run away. She ran toward freedom. And if she's the one in that Oregon newspaper article, Paige said slowly, working through the implications, then she built a boarding house for women. She spent her life helping other women escape bad situations. She transformed her pain into purpose, Wesley said, the words resonating with what he'd said earlier about the house. Just like we talked about doing. Delaine carefully turned to another page in the Bible, one with legal notations added in more recent ink. This is why Sutherland thought I had a strong claim. Catherine, my grandmother, was Aldrich Pemberton's legitimate grandchild, even if born from assault. When Constance disappeared and the Pemberton line died out, the inheritance should have passed through Catherine. But because the family had hidden her existence, covered up the birth, she was never included in any legal proceedings, which means the property transfer was never legally complete, Paige said. Exactly. The house has been in legal limbo for 80 years. The county thought they had clear title when they seized it for taxes, but they didn't. Not really. Wesley sat back, his mind spinning. So you do own it. Legally, legitimately, you're the rightful heir. Probably, Delaine said. If I wanted to pursue it, if I wanted to go through the courts and make my case public, but that would mean exposing my grandmother's story, putting my own name in legal records, inviting scrutiny and attention. She looked up at them, her expression raw. It would mean stepping back into visibility when I've spent 3 years learning to disappear. But you'd have a home, Paige said gently. A real one. Not something you're squatting in or hiding in, but a place that's actually yours. It would be ours, Delaine corrected, looking between them. That's what I'm trying to say. If I pursue this claim, I don't want to do it alone. I want to establish some kind of legal structure where we all have rights to the property. A trust or co-ownership or something. I don't know exactly how it would work legally, but I know I don't want to own that house by myself. Wesley felt something unlock in his chest, a weight he hadn't known he was carrying suddenly lifting. You want to share it? I want to transform it, Delaine said, her voice growing stronger. Not just restore the building, but change what it means. Constance was trapped there, then had to flee from it. But what if we made it into something different? A place where people who are running from trauma or shame or failure could find refuge. Where they could be invisible for a while, but in a safe way, with support. Like a sanctuary, Paige said, her eyes lighting up with understanding. Or a residency, Delaine continued, ideas flowing now. For artists, for people recovering from life crises, for anyone who needs time and space to rebuild themselves. We could offer it freely or for minimal cost. We could create workshops, provide job training like you mentioned. Paige, we could make it a place of transformation instead of tragedy. Wesley stood up, pacing the small room as the vision took shape in his mind. We'd need money for renovations, for legal fees to establish the trust, for operating costs. I have some savings still, Delaine said. Not much, but something. And we could apply for grants, seek donations. If we establish it as a non-profit, the house is big enough, Paige interrupted excitedly. 14 rooms. We could live in part of it and use the rest for others. We could house maybe 6 or 8 people at a time. Give them 3 to 6 months to figure things out. We'd all need to work, Wesley said practically, to support ourselves and contribute to expenses. I can go back to teaching, Delaine said, then paused, fear crossing her face. Or maybe not. Maybe I'm still too scared for that. Then you teach there, Paige said firmly. Art classes for the residents. Share your skills. You don't have to go back to your old life to use what you learned from it. Wesley looked at both women, seeing hope and purpose dawning in their faces, and felt it mirroring in his own chest. So, we're really doing this? We're really doing this, Delaine confirmed. If you'll have me, if you can forgive me for not being honest from the start. Paige stood and pulled Delaine into a hug, surprising all 3 of them. There's nothing to forgive, she said. We all hid in our own ways. The difference is we're choosing to stop hiding now. Wesley joined the embrace, the 3 of them holding on to each other in the cold cottage that Delaine would never have to return to. Outside, Benson barked once, as if giving his approval to whatever decision they'd reached. We should go home, Wesley said finally. We have a lot of work to do. Delaine pulled back, wiping her eyes. Give me 10 minutes to pack. Pack everything, Paige said. You're not coming back here. 6 months later, in the soft light of early spring, Wesley stood on the front porch of what they now called Constance House and watched the first residents arrive. The legal process had been complex, but ultimately successful. Delaine's claim had been validated through the family Bible and supporting documentation. Rather than taking sole ownership, she'd worked with a lawyer to establish a charitable trust, with herself, Wesley, and Paige as co-trustees. The house belonged to all of them now, and more importantly, it belonged to its purpose. The winter had been consumed by work, both physical and bureaucratic. They'd completed essential repairs, brought the house up to code, and established Constance House as a non-profit organization. Wesley had taken on more hours at the hardware store, Paige continued at the elementary school, and Delaine had begun teaching art classes at the community center 2 towns over. Small steps back into visibility, each one a little less frightening than the last. They'd received a modest grant from a regional foundation focused on housing initiatives, enough to cover 6 months of operating expenses. Word had spread through social service networks, and applications had come in, more than they could accommodate, each one representing a person seeking refuge from circumstances that had become unbearable. They'd selected 5 residents for the first session, a woman in her 60s leaving an abusive marriage after 40 years, a young veteran struggling with PTSD and homelessness, a former teacher like Delaine who'd lost everything to addiction and was 18 months into recovery, a divorced father trying to rebuild after bankruptcy, and a recent college graduate whose anxiety had made traditional life paths impossible. Wesley greeted each arrival personally, Benson wagging beside him, remembering his own first glimpse of this house when it had seemed like both salvation and surrender. He saw that same mixture of hope and desperation in each face as they carried their belongings up the front steps. "Welcome to Constance House," he said to each one. "You're home now, for as long as you need." Paige had organized the practical side of things with characteristic efficiency. She'd created orientation packets, established house guidelines that emphasized mutual respect and shared responsibility, and set up a schedule for the workshops and support groups they'd be offering. But she'd also made sure each bedroom had fresh flowers, that the kitchen was stocked with comfort foods, that there were soft blankets and good reading lights. Small touches that said, "You matter, you're valued, you belong here." Delaine had prepared the art studio in what had once been the sealed wing, where she'd hidden for so many months. The space was filled with natural light now, the windows cleaned until they sparkled, easels and supplies arranged invitingly. She'd hung some of her own paintings on the walls, including the one of the three of them in the garden, which had become a kind of mission statement for what they were building. That evening, they gathered everyone in the main parlor for an informal welcome dinner. The residents were cautious with each other, the way strangers thrown together always are, but Wesley could see them beginning to relax as they shared the meal Paige had prepared. After dinner, Delaine stood and cleared her throat nervously. She'd been dreading this moment, speaking to a group, making herself visible and vulnerable, but Wesley had encouraged her, and she'd agreed it was important. "I want to tell you a story," she began, her voice quiet but steady, "about a woman who lived in this house 80 years ago. She told them about Constance, about the trauma she'd endured, the family that had imprisoned her, the desperate choice she'd made to disappear. She showed them the diary entry, the final words written before Constance fled into the unknown. For a long time I thought her story was about running away," Delaine said. "I thought she was a cautionary tale about how shame and fear can make us vanish from our own lives. And in a way, that's true. But I've come to understand it differently now." She paused, looking around at the faces watching her, these strangers who were already becoming something like family simply by being here, by choosing to try again. Constance wasn't just running from something. She was running toward the possibility of a different life, and she found it. We have evidence that she survived, that she built something meaningful, a place where other women could find safety. She transformed her pain into purpose, her escape into service. Delaine's eyes found Wesley's, then Paige's. "That's what we're trying to do here. Not to help you hide from the world, but to give you a place where you can be invisible for a while if you need to be, where you can heal without judgment, where you can figure out who you want to become next. And then, when you're ready, you can step back into visibility, but on your own terms, carrying your story instead of being buried by it." One of the residents, the older woman leaving her marriage, raised her hand tentatively. "What if we're never ready? What if we can't find our way back?" Wesley spoke up from where he sat near the fireplace. "Then you stay here as long as you need. But I'll tell you what I've learned. Being ready doesn't mean being fearless. It means being willing to try, even when you're scared. All three of us who live here are still scared most days. But we're scared together, and that makes it bearable." The evening wound down gradually, residents drifting to their rooms, exhausted by travel and emotion and the strange relief of arriving somewhere safe. Wesley, Paige, and Delaine cleaned up together, working in the comfortable silence of people who'd learned to communicate without constant words. Later, Wesley stood in the garden where spring bulbs were just beginning to push through the soil. Bulbs Delaine had planted in the fall, with trembling hope that they'd all still be here to see them bloom. Paige joined him, slipping her arm through his. "Do you think this will work?" she asked quietly. "Really work?" Wesley thought about the question, about the 5 people now sleeping under their roof, about the weight of responsibility they'd taken on, about all the ways this experiment in shared healing could fail. "I think we'll figure it out as we go," he said finally. "Together." Delaine emerged from the house carrying 3 mugs of tea. She handed them out and stood with them in the garden, all three looking back at the mansion with its lighted windows glowing warm against the darkening sky. "The house remembers how to hold life," Delaine said softly, echoing the title of her painting. Wesley smiled, feeling something settle into place inside him. Not certainty, but something better. Purpose, belonging, home. "And we remember how to live in it," he said. Above them, stars were beginning to appear in the clear spring sky. Inside, in rooms throughout the mansion, people who'd been lost were finding their way toward rest. And in the garden, three people who'd each bought their own kind of refuge for $75 worth of courage stood together, no longer hiding, finally home.